and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing on CCTV News. I'm your host, Tian Wei. On today's program, Filipino President Rodrigo Duterte is on his first visit to China. The new leader reached out to Beijing after years of bad blood between the two countries. So will relations between the two now improve? And we speak exclusively to Bonnie Glaser, an expert on Asia from the United States. She gives her opinion on U.S.-China ties and the United States' future approach to the Asia-Pacific region. Let's start tonight's show with the Filipino President Rodrigo Duterte's visit to China. President Xi Jinping from China held talks with his Filipino counterpart after extending a warm welcome to Beijing to him. Beijing-Manila ties have improved greatly, some say, in recent weeks, as both leaders focus on common goals, such as building trade and ensuring regional peace. Take a look at this.
Rolling out the red carpet, Chinese President Xi Jinping held a welcoming ceremony for Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte at the Great Hall of the People in Beijing. President Duterte's state visit to China is his first visit to a foreign country outside ASEAN since taking office in June. Bilateral relations have gone through many twists and turns over the past few years. Both leaders agreed to sit down this time for talks in good faith.
I hope we can follow the wishes of the people from the standpoint of mutually essential and common interests, and use this visit as an opportunity to push China-Philippines relations back on friendly footing and improve the relationship in all aspects.
Duterte is accompanied by at least 200 Filipino business elites to pave the way for what he calls a new commercial alliance.
The defining moment of my presidency, to open frontiers of friendship and cooperation, enhancement of an old relationship between our two countries.
Signs of progress are evident, with the two presidents overseeing the signing of agreements worth $13.5 billion that cover maritime cooperation as well as investment, trade, and infrastructure.
Everyone can see the agreements that we have signed this time, including cooperation between the two countries' Coast Guard departments, marks the start of the two countries' maritime cooperation.
The two countries have been engaged in a maritime dispute over the South China Sea. Earlier this year, an arbitration tribunal in The Hague broke with international customs to support the former Philippine government's disputed claims. Beijing refused to accept the controversial trial. It's now time to write a new chapter.
For more on the Filipino President Rodrigo Duterte's visit to China, we are now joined by our two panelists. In Beijing, we have Mr. Ye Hailin, who is a researcher with the National Institute of International Strategy, Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Welcome, sir. Meanwhile, joining us from Manila, from the Philippines, we have Mr. Richard Hidarian, political science professor at De La Salle University from the Philippines. Welcome, Professor. To both of you, what do you make of the nature of this specific meeting between President from the Philippines, Duterte, and President Xi from China? How much of it, Professor, from the Philippines, is it about the South China Sea? That just asked that way.
Well, first of all, let me say that for the past few months during our interviews, we discussed this possibility that actually Duterte will visit China among his first state visits, and this is actually his first major state visit, which is unprecedented because other Filipino presidents tend to go first to Washington or perhaps to Tokyo before going to a place like China. So this says a lot about how China is at the top of the pecking order of Duterte's strategic priorities. Now, I think this trip, in terms of optics, has been excellent. It has gone a long way in breaking the ice in frosty bilateral relationship. And I think it has injected a lot of normalization into bilateral ties. And if you look at the discussion, President Duterte has been focused more so far on economics. You have $13.5 billion of business deals, around $3 billion of possible Chinese infrastructure investment in the Philippines. You may have reduction of Chinese restrictions on Filipino imports. That's why he brought big tycoons with himself. But there seems to be also some discussion on the South China Sea disputes, but so far we're getting conflicting information from the Philippine government.
Professor Hidarian, let's just make comments directly. We heard from President Duterte when he was speaking to the business community and the local community in China from the Philippines. He said that he is not going to bring up the South China Sea issue on his own first. He said this is the respect in Asian culture we have for the host. Later we heard Professor Hidarian from the Chinese Vice Minister of Foreign Relations, Mr. Liu Zhemin. He said this: Coast Guards and fishery cooperation has been agreed upon by the two leaders. He did not answer any question regarding fishermen from the Philippines, any possibility to fish near the Huangyan Islands, which is the controversial issue. So what do you make of the specific talk so far?
Well, first of all, when it comes to Duterte, sometimes he tries to play to different audiences. So when he was in Manila a few days ago, he said he's going to raise the issue, and to make sure that the discussion of South China Sea will be within the framework of the Philippine arbitration case. Once he landed in Beijing, he's sounding a little bit different. I think that was out of respect. I think he really appreciates the amount of respect and goodwill that the Chinese leaders have shown him. So he felt it was a little bit disrespectful, or it's going to slight his host. That's why he said that. But from what I know, based on reports and based on my different contacts, it seems behind the scenes there have actually been negotiations on a joint fishery agreements in the Scarborough Shoal to allow the Filipino fishermen to also have access there. This is very politically important because Duterte cannot just go home with economic goodies. He also has to show to the Filipino people that he's going to get also some good compromise in the South China Sea. I even heard that there could be a discussion of a joint oil exploration in the Reed Bank. But it seems the president doesn't want to talk about those things too much. Perhaps he feels they're too controversial and he doesn't want to rock the boat.
All right, let me go to you, Mr. Ye here in Beijing. What about that fact that both leaders have agreed, as being expressed to the media, that the South China Sea is not the sum total of the two countries' relationship? What does that tell us about the realizations from both sides, about the nature of relations in the past 1 or 2 years, and their possible future ahead?
For the last 3 years, we know the China and the Philippine bilateral relation only focusing on one thing, the South China Sea. And let's verify what is going on. Nothing happened. Neither China nor Philippines could say, okay, through this argument, China or Philippines got what they want. So it's far away. So this time, for the visit of the President Duterte to China, I think China was not expecting Duterte won't mention the South China Sea issue. It's not our Chinese stance. I think we can talk, we can discuss, we can hold our opinion, we can agree to disagree. So this naturally. But the question is that, do we only have one thing to talk about? Obviously, there's many issues we can explore. So that's the question to answer. That's the answer to answer. What's the priority for the current bilateral relation?
And what is the priority, Mr. Ye?
I think in my understanding that we should look beyond the South China Sea issue. There are many issues, such as the cooperation, the economic cooperation, such as the OBOR initiatives, and such as the Philippines' demand and China's capability to boost the bilateral contacts. So there's many things. Key point is that both sides need to realize only arguing on the South China Sea won't make the situation better.
What about the other area? The trade. And of course you heard from the Filipino President Duterte clearly, commercial alliance is a big word to be used, by the way, of course that's coming from the Filipino President. What do you make of that specific phrase, briefly from you, and then I go to our Filipino President.
In the matter of fact, actually China and the Philippines has been to the commercial alliance for a very long time. Even during the dispute on the South China Sea, still these two countries hold very tight commercial relations. So that means a lot. It doesn't mean we have to stay on the South China Sea issue and then go anything else. We can't do the things at the same time.
Well, can we do the same thing at the same time? Let's see some of the numbers, as you said, Mr. Ye, that the trade relations has always been a very important part. China is Philippines' top source for imports, second largest trading partner, and also the third largest export market. Even when political relations between the two sides soured last year, the economic ties remained warm. Bilateral trade in 2015 hit over $45.6 billion, a 2.7% increase still in the year 2015, despite the disputes on than a year earlier. So, what do you make of it, Professor Heydarian, in the Philippines? Is that trade relationship likely to lead us to what your president called a commercial alliance? What would that mean?
Well, I mean, first thing first, you're correct to say that the volume of trade has remained substantial despite all the acrimony over the South China Sea disputes. But the terms of the trade actually have deteriorated. It used to be, the Philippines used to have a smaller trade deficit with China. So now the trade deficit has increased. That's why during his trip, President Duterte brought a lot of Filipino businessmen so that the Philippines can also gain more access to China's consumer market, which is one of the biggest in the world. The second thing is investments. China's share of investments, foreign direct investment stock, is less than 1%. While the US is 13% and Japan is even way more. So there's a lot of room for improvement in terms of Chinese investments, particularly in the realm of infrastructure. This is where Duterte's heart is. He wants China to help the Philippines to develop its infrastructure, particularly in his home island of Mindanao. So expect a lot of Chinese projects starting in the Philippines perhaps in the coming months or not years. And of course, if China enters the Philippine infrastructure market, that puts pressure on Japan and other countries to also be more competitive. So Duterte, because of this trip, has made the Philippine infrastructure landscape more promising. So that's why the stakes were very high in terms of bilateral economic relations, even if the volume of trade has not been compromised by the South China Sea disputes.
3 billion, that is the number being signed at this time between the two countries, come to China's provision of possibility support for infrastructure building inside the Philippines. But that, of course, is the loan. It's nothing else, it's the loan. How much sign does it give us as to China's competitiveness into the Filipino infrastructure market?
I think China has
Is it going to push others out of the market?
I don't think the Philippines market is so small, only for $3 billion US dollars. Actually, it's a huge market. So I think the Philippines market could open to all the countries who has the intention and the capacity to put the investment. Question is that China left behind due to the obvious reason, the South China Sea dispute. So if we are talking about FDI or infrastructure construction, for the last couple of years, China is left behind. Now China could catch up, although there is still something uncertain. For instance, the South China Sea dispute is still there. The two countries' stance is quite far away. But the question is that now the two countries can manage this dispute and then leave their a very huge space room for the two countries to focusing on the economy, cooperation, and coordination. So I think this does not necessarily means China would keep another country out. Obviously, after all, 3 billion is not a big number.
Okay, talking about other countries, we are not just focusing on the political and economic tie between China and Philippines because there are other players in the region and beyond. The United States, Professor Heydarian, is one of those obvious countries we have to mention. There seems to be, according to President Duterte, some very obvious remarks he wants to have Washington heard. He said that during his trip to China that he will not go to the United States because he said once he go there, the Filipinos would only be quote-unquote insulted. What do you make of the remarks like this? Does it in any way show President Duterte's determined policies already toward Washington?
I don't think so. I think the thing with President Duterte is that he says a lot of things, and sometimes they're more bravado and braggadocio. I mean, let's remember, President Obama is stepping down in coming months. This is his final 100 days. So there's no reason for Duterte to think about going to U.S. unless we know who's going to be the next American president, and whether it's Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton, that represents its own matrix of calculations for the Philippines to consider. But remember, in 5 days, he's going to visit Japan also, which is the #1 ally of the United States, and expect Japan also to put a lot of economic incentives on the table to counterbeat China. So in fairness to Duterte, he has created this very dynamic competition among major economic powers to fight over the Philippine goodwill and the Philippine infrastructure landscape. So some very interesting dynamic things happening there. And the other thing is this, he says a lot of things about severing ties with the U.S., ending the alliance with the U.S., goodbye to the U.S., but so far we have not even gotten a confirmation that bilateral exercises with the U.S. will be cancelled. So sometimes we have to take his statements with a grain of salt.
All right. At this moment, Professor Heydarian, during his visit to China, there is a demonstration going on in front of the U.S. Embassy inside Manila about the Filipino people demanding the U.S. out of Mindanao, which is an important place for President Duterte to begin with. Is there likely to be an upswing trend politically inside the Philippines as a result of whether the remarks or the actions coming from the president?
Well, Duterte is a very popular president. More than 80% of people have expressed trust and confidence in him. Nonetheless, despite his dust-ups with the United States, it seems that America is still very popular in the Philippines. A survey came out yesterday that showed America has a positive net 66% approval rating in the Philippines. So it seems by and large the Filipinos still have a positive view of the United States. And these protests, while getting a lot of media coverage because of some unfortunate incident involving the police cracking down on them, they're relatively small. They're not actually that large. So Duterte is actually going against the public opinion here by trying to reach out to China. And Duterte is trying very hard to portray China as a positive partner for peace for the Philippines, because in the Philippines, approval ratings of China is very low, actually.
From the Chinese perspective, what do you make of this apparent Filipino president leaving or trying to distancing away from Washington, at least for the moment?
Very frankly speaking, I think this question should ask American. It's American should think about his attitude to one of his major alliances in the Southeast Asia.
We're going to ask an American expert later after our conversation.
That's the question is that I don't think Duterte is only because of he want to make the balance on the South China Sea issue or try to get better his relationship with China. It's also because of American takes a very, very negative towards the president himself. So in this case, for the China's perspective, I think we would like to see Philippine and the U.S. relation remain stable. That means no any unexpected accident happen. But we also would like to see American could a little bit adjust his attitude to his alliance and also another ASEAN, maybe not very strong country, but still a very important country for the whole region's stability and the peace.
Well, the Philippine the country itself is going to be very important. ASEAN chair, likely 2017. That is going to be the Philippines' rotating presidency. Come back to you, Professor Hidarian. Yes. What is it? I mean, for this, what some consider as abrupt change of foreign policy by the Filipino government after President Duterte comes into office toward the United States. Is it political shrewdness? Is it political belief against the West? Or is it a very smart adjustment about what he believes the future is?
I think it's definitely a combination of all those factors. I think Duterte personally has reservations with U.S. He calls himself a socialist. He has some anti-imperialist kind of mindset that has been there for a long time. He had some bad experiences with the U.S. when he was the mayor of Davao. That's one thing. The second thing is very irritated with Americans' criticism of his war on drugs, on human rights conditions. He feels the U.S. has no business to criticize him so openly, so publicly. But thirdly, there's also a matter of strategic recalibration, because under the previous president for Duterte, the Philippines was too much in the American camp. So now Duterte is trying to bring the Philippines a little bit more to the center. So while Duterte is making a wild swing in terms of rhetoric, in actuality, the Philippines is moving actually more to the center, whereby it can equibalance between the two superpowers. I think that is where most likely the Philippines will end up if we really try to scratch below the surface and not to be overwhelmed by Duterte's often headline-grabbing statements.
Not just rhetorics, but also exact actions. Of course, that's important. Mr. Ye, Chinese President Xi Jinping, when he was meeting with President Duterte from the Philippines, he used this word: China and the Philippines are brothers. And he said, of course, the relations between the two should not be revered by some of the recent events. Having said that, though, what kind of nature do you think the Chinese believe its relationship with the Philippines? Will the two countries be able to mend their fences as if nothing have happened before? Will bad feelings still remain? How long will they remain? Or actually, it's going to be a totally new page?
No, I don't think it's a totally new page. Question is that why the President Duterte can decide the foreign policy doctrine of the Philippines for a very long time. There is many different interest group and lobbyist group in Philippines, and all this has a very influential and a very strong foreign background. So it's not it's very difficult to say President Duterte can hold his foreign policy for how long to the end of his term. But also we should notice that for China, Philippines never is China's major threat. We have the problem, we have the dispute with Philippines, but Philippines is not the Chinese rival. And only when the Philippines choose a side of the American alliance and fighting for American interest, there will be a Chinese problem. And there will be serious impact to the bilateral relation. Otherwise, only the South China Sea dispute. For the last half a century, China and the Philippines has this issue, but we managed pretty well.
All right. Before we go, another very important set of questions. That is, what about the Philippines' role in the Southeast Asia? As I said, Professor Heydarian, Philippine chair for ASEAN 2017. Philippines also, some consider, did its job during the APEC summit 2015. So with adjustment of foreign policy, at least apparently, how is Philippines going to be viewed by its ASEAN neighbors, therefore play its role?
Yeah. Well, I mean, without the question, some Asian neighbors also have been quite scandalized by some of Duterte's expletives and some of his bravado and braggadocio. But I think largely the ASEAN as a whole appreciated the fact that President Duterte had a much more, I would say, pragmatic approach to the South China Sea. Unlike his predecessor, who was more of a China hawk and pressuring ASEAN to adopt a stronger position against China. So now that the Philippines is taking up the chairmanship of the ASEAN and other regional fora, I think now the Philippines is moving actually to the center, to the consensus among majority of ASEAN countries who believe that bilateral engagement and dialogue is, at the end of the day, the best way forward. So in that sense, actually, Duterte is much closer to the consensus of the rest of the ASEAN than his predecessor.
Mr. Ye, also final words from you before we go. 2017, very important year. New president of the United States comes into power. China also going to experience an important political year. The Philippines become the ASEAN chair. All of these combined, what would that mean?
Very short term, that China will and would respect the Philippines speak on behalf of themselves and also on behalf of the ASEAN because he is the chair. But if Philippines, just like the Duterte's predecessor, speak on behalf of another country's interest, it will be the problem.
All right, we're going to see what's going to happen. Certainly some very exciting developments recently, a lot of things to catch up with. Thank you so much, Professor Richard Heydarian, coming from the Philippines, and Mr. Ye Hailin here in Beijing with us in China. Thank you, really appreciate it, gentlemen. Stay with us here on World Insight, still to come. Bonnie Glaser is a widely published expert on Asia with an American think tank. She's also widely believed as so-called a hawk. She speaks exclusively to us on U.S.-China ties and how she sees Washington's Asia-Pacific policy adjusting in the future. The United States' pivot to Asia policy is a trademark policy of the Obama administration and has caused great concern in China. The Asia-Pacific region has been some heated territory disputes since its policy in place. With the U.S. about to undergo leadership change, how will players in the region be affected?
Focusing on Asia, the United States foreign policy made a shift under the Obama administration by turning its focus to East and South Asia from the Middle East and Europe. The pivot to Asia policy drew concerns from Beijing, especially as the U.S. has a historical presence in the region and traditional allies on China's eastern coast. And that American presence seems to have turned into a military one. The U.S. has frequently held military drills with its allies in the region. As China's economic and military strength expands, the country's navy has started to shoulder escort responsibilities far beyond its coastal border. China has also become increasingly assertive over long-standing maritime territorial claims. The South China Sea disputes peaked when the Philippines took China to an arbitral tribunal whose ruling Beijing rejected and the U.S. welcomed. However, though historically a strong ally of the States, the new Philippine administration is more willing to sit down and talk to China. With U.S. elections just around the corner, more variables may be added to Asia-Pacific relations. Whether these will help stabilizing the region remains to be seen.
And what about the U.S. foreign policy in the Asia-Pacific region? Recently, I had a chance to speak to Bonnie Glaser, Senior Advisor for Asia and Director of the Chinese Power Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. She shared with us her views on the U.S. role in the Pacific region in the possible next few years. Ms. Glaser, welcome to CCTV News.
Thank you for having me on the show.
We've seen some different approaches or different strategies or different understanding about what the future should be like in the Asia-Pacific region. You talk about China, and there are other countries who work with China very closely, rather regarding the United States as a destabilizing factor. Some countries do. It might be a minority. And there are other countries, such as the Philippines or others, who are changing, apparently, strategically, about what their position should be toward the United States, toward China, and their position in the region. What do you make of these different kinds of diversity of voices, and what would that mean for the U.S. decision?
Well, every country in the region wants to protect its own interests, and none of the countries in the Asia-Pacific region really wants to have to choose fundamentally between the U.S. and China. So even an ally like Japan of the United States wants to have a good relationship with China. And it would be a failed policy if either Beijing or Washington were to try to press countries to choose. I think that's a big mistake. So every country is just trying to balance its interests. Those that are geographically very close to China are especially leery of engaging in actions in which they're too close to the United States. So we see countries like Cambodia and Laos, for example, that lean more towards China politically. Countries that are farther away and those that have disputes with China over maritime territory, for example, they often want to align with the United States or position themselves in the middle. The Philippines is a very special case. It's been a U.S. ally for a long, long time, and I think it remains to be seen whether or not it is repositioning itself. One thing that President Duterte has set as a goal in the near term is to get the Filipino fishermen to be able to return to Scarborough Shoal. So I think that's his near-term goal. Whether or not he's going to fundamentally alter, weaken the alliance relationship with the United States, I think remains to be seen. There's a lot of support for him in the Philippines, but primarily because of his anti-drug campaign, not because of his anti-American statements and actions.
So what you're saying, Ms. Glaser, seems to me is suggesting no matter what others' positions are, the U.S. policy toward the Asia-Pacific region will always remain the same, and the role the U.S. plays will always remain the same? Or there has been a lack of thinking about what the U.S. role should be, given the changes and possible changes of different countries' strategic positioning of themselves in the Asia-Pacific region?
Well, I think it's unavoidable to react to some extent to changes that are taking place. But that doesn't ultimately change U.S. strategy and U.S. interests. But I believe that fundamentally, most countries in the region want the United States to maintain a presence, to not have a confrontation with China, but to help influence China's choices so that China rises peacefully and other countries can have more room to maneuver. So I think U.S. strategy, of course, will respond to what is happening in the region. But I think our interests, we are an Asia-Pacific power. The United States has long been present in this region, and I think will continue to be so in the future.
After the chaotic situation of the tribunal ruling in the South China Sea, China believes it shouldn't be part or any part of the future negotiations. And that specific tribunal has been illegal to begin with, and China do not accept any of the result. Well, Others, for example, the Philippines, with the new administration, seem to have a very different view about that ruling. And also, the President Duterte is to visit China to further discuss with China about future ties. At this critical juncture, what do you think would be the smart choices countries can make regarding what happened in the past?
I don't think that he wants to put this issue front and center in his discussions with China. But there is a potential road forward for improvement in China's relations with the Philippines that could defuse some of the tensions in the South China Sea.
What does that mean then for the United States if China and the Philippines can work together and bring a peaceful solution to the previous and earlier conflicts?
Well, in my view, there would be a potential convergence between what China and the Philippines would do and then American interests. So if China's relations with the Philippines can improve and these actions don't take place, then I think there is less pressure on the United States to continue to conduct the kind of operations that China objects to.
We saw so many debates going on all at the same time about many issues. But one of the most undecided factor, shall I say, in every debate is about what's next for the United States. Of course, you have a presidential election cycle going on right now, but many are interested in understanding what's likely to be the direction. Of course, you have very different candidates at this moment. They have totally different views about the world. But from your perspective, where is the United States looking at for the near future?
Well, the United States has various issues that it is quite concerned about. Some are in the Middle East, some are in Europe, some are in Asia. And it will in part depend on what happens in those regions as to where U.S. attention and resources are focused. My personal view as an expert on Asia is that I believe that Asia should be among the highest priorities of the next U.S. president. We have threats here in the Asia-Pacific region, and we have opportunities. There are expectations of countries that we will be here that I think we need to meet because we have credibility issues. Countries here are concerned about U.S. staying power. There are scenarios one could imagine that if the United States were not present in this region, that could potentially lead to a lot of instability.
Well, we all understand that people's foreign policies, countries' foreign policies are designed for their own national interests. Well, there are concerns from others, but eventually what is the United States, do you think, should be looking at in the Asia-Pacific region? The opportunities you talk about, what are these opportunities for Washington?
Well, the opportunities for the United States are to expand our relevance, our partnerships, to work with other countries, to strengthen institutions in this region, along with other countries, multilateral cooperation, bilateral, trilateral cooperation. We've already seen quite a bit of change in recent years. U.S., China, and South Korea are doing more. U.S., ASEAN, we are cooperating in new ways. There's always greater potential for the U.S. and China to cooperate, but frankly, it is easier in areas outside the Asia-Pacific region to cooperate than in this region because of the fact that it's closer to China. But I continue to believe that on issues like North Korea, our interests don't completely coincide, but they overlap. And I think that when a new president is inaugurated in the U.S. on January 20th, that the North Korean nuclear issue is going to be very, very high on that agenda, and that the U.S. president is going to look to China, as many presidents have done, to try and figure out how to solve this problem, because it has become, for the United States, increasingly an existential threat. It is not just a theoretical threat. The pace of nuclear and missile tests of North Korea has become very dangerous, that under a 4-year term of a new president, that it is quite possible that North Korea will be able to miniaturize a warhead, put it on an ICBM, and deliver it to the continental United States. And that's a threat the United States cannot accept. It must respond.
But how well do you think a new administration, given your knowledge of your own politics back at home, be able to handle these strategic issues, not only the DPRK nuclear issue, but also the South China Sea issue, for example, and also some of the other issues such as the future of Taiwan in the region, the future of relations between Japan and the United States, just to mention a few. How much equipped with intelligence and with wisdom do you think the new administration will be able to handle it, given the fact we don't even know who will be in the new administration?
Well, personalities matter, so we do have to see who the U.S. president is.
Particularly this time.
Yes, this is a particularly unusual situation, but I do believe that the United States is already, to some extent, on the right path in Asia. There's much more that can be done, but I believe that President Obama has laid a very, very strong foundation. And I think the big question for the new president regarding this region and our relations with the region is just how we balance all of our relationships. Is the U.S.-China relationship the top priority? Is our alliances? What's the relations between our ties with China, with our partners, and our alliances? How do we fit all of those together? And I think that the Obama administration has been successful in both expanding cooperation with China and then also managing the growing competition, and particularly strategic competition between our two countries. And I think that will continue, and that a new American president has to be prepared with a strategy to do that. Because if we do not handle our relationship with China well, the rest of the region becomes very nervous, and then the rebalance is probably then bound to fail. So I remain optimistic, but I think that there will be unexpected challenges for the United States, and not just in the Asia-Pacific region. I think the biggest question mark is whether events somewhere else, like in the Middle East, once again pull U.S. attention away from the Asia-Pacific region. And some countries might like to see that, but there are others that I think would not.
Thank you so much, Ms. Glazer, for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. That's Bonnie Glazer from the United States. Many consider that as a hawkish voice, but at this moment, when the relations between China and the Philippines is improving, many are wondering what are the attitudes coming from Washington. Her words could be of some reference. Well, that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more of our program, visit our website. Just type in World Insight CCTV News into your search engine. You will be able to find us. Or you can also check out our YouTube channel. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again tomorrow for more insights from across China and around the world. Good night.